I'm Don Holden at the Art Students League of New York. I'm standing in the second floor studio where I studied with Robert Beverly Hale in 1947. When Robert Beverly Hale, Bob Hale to me, retired from the League in 1982, he was the most famous teacher at America's most famous art school. His classes on figure drawing and artistic anatomy were legendary. He was, to put it simply, a great teacher. He was, incidentally, at the same time, the first curator of American art at the Metropolitan Museum, the founding curator of the department. He also taught at Columbia. He was legendary. He was a great teacher. Now, I can think of at least 4 great art teachers in this country, in this century. 3 were teachers of painting: Charles Hawthorne, Robert Henri, Hans Hofmann. 1 is a teacher of drawing, Bob Hale, figure drawing. I sometimes think a great teacher is like a great stage actor. When he stops working, his work vanishes. It exists only in the memories of those people who saw him do it. Now, sometimes a great teacher like Hawthorne or Henri leaves behind a book of classroom notes. In Bob Hale's case, we have a marvelous version of his lectures, a book called Master Class in Figure Drawing. But what we would really love, our dream, is to see a great teacher on film or tape. In the case of Hawthorne or Henri or Hofmann, so far as I know, such a film or such a tape doesn't exist. In Bob Hale's case, we got lucky. Somebody at the Art Students League in the 1970s, I guess, got the inspired idea of recording Bob's 10 famous lectures with a fairly crude old hunk of videotaping equipment. And so we have a permanent record of what Bob Hale did. The tapes are crude, but they're riveting. Now, what did Bob Hale really teach? What did he do? He taught some kind of magical wedding of figure drawing and anatomy, not the medical anatomy of cadavers, but the living anatomy of the human figure as artists wanted to capture it. His method was based on the drawing methods of the great masters of the figure, like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Rubens, Raphael, all of whom were masters of anatomy. Now, of course, what makes a great teacher is not his method, but the man, the magic of the man. And that's something which is beyond words. You're going to see that in a moment. But I do remember one other thing, one basic philosophical assumption, if you will, from my days in this studio in the 1940s. Above all, what Bob Hale communicated was that drawing was a rational decision-making process. That everything you did was a decision. You don't draw what you see. You look and you decide what you see, and then you draw it. Bob has always loved a story about Whistler, which really makes this point. One of Whistler's students went to the great artist and said, "I paint what I see." And Whistler said, "Well, you see what you paint." You're now going to see lecture number 1 on the rib cage.
Well, it's nice to see that so many people are interested in anatomy. Well, we have to remember that it's very much the scientific side of art, and that art is much more important than just techniques. But I talk largely about techniques, as you know. Tonight I thought that I'd give you a sort of an introduction to anatomy, but actually I'm going to talk more about the spinal column than anything, because certainly It's the most important form in our body, I think, from the artist's point of view. You see, we have to remember that we're descended from animals. That is, from the Darwinian point of view. You know, as artists, you ought to regard the superstitions of scientists and the superstitions of religion with equal admiration, perhaps. But for the sake of anatomy, we're descended from animals, and we have all the same bones and muscles. And the animals, you know, four-footed animals, are in this position. You see how much we are alike? We're like the horses or the cats or anything you want, except we assume another position. But our muscles are all very much the same. And we have the inevitable spinal column or backbone, the backbone on the top of which is the head. Then we have two girdles, you know, the shoulder girdle from which the arms or forelimbs. Might be better to think of as an animal. Many of these terms come from the animals. The forelimbs descend from the shoulder girdle, and the rear limbs descend from the pelvis. And that's the great pattern that has been repeated and repeated and repeated, and hasn't been changed very much, you know, since we crawled out of the sea some time back. So I thought tonight we might draw some animal. It doesn't much matter what animal, because they're all so much alike, but I thought we might draw a horse and examine him, and then we'll examine one of our early ancestors who went about on four legs, and then see how it came about that he rose from the four-legged position to the delicately balanced individuals we are. We're on two legs, you know. No, none of the other animals walk around on two legs the way we do. The birds do pretty well, but they lean forward in front a great deal. But we stand erect and look the world in the face. A horse, the horse's anatomy is one of the easiest to learn because there are so many books on the anatomy of horses. I think they might be because they're mostly in English, and as you know, the British Empire is practically founded on the horse. And you can go to the Museum of Natural History up there, a lovely library they have, and look up the anatomy of any animal you want. But a horse naturally would have a head. He'd have a head, and we could just feel the mass of the head. We could give him an ear. There are even books up there that tell you how to find the proportion of animals in relation to their heads. A book by Ernest Thompson Seton, for instance. And I know if you take a horse's head and come down here and get a little further, you get to the shoulder blade, things like that were in those books. Now we come to a great difference. These individual vertebrae up here are called the cervical or neck vertebrae. And we're mammals, you know, we're mammals, and all mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae, with 2 exceptions, the giant sloth and the manatee. But they don't turn up here to pose at the art students' league much. It doesn't make much difference. But all the others have 7 cervical vertebrae. So do we. Also, on the animals, the skeleton of the neck moves in an S curve, which you'll see is not like us. It then turns into a profound C curve, concave to the bottom, and moves like that. That line I've drawn is the line of the animal backbone. You know, you can put a nice horse in a square if you wish. About like that, I guess. Now, when we study the backbone on men or animals, let's think of a man for a moment. It's much more important to study this front line here, which on the animal would be the bottom of the backbone, this line here, this feel here, than it is to just stroke the back of the animal. The reason is that these things called dorsal spines stick out differently in different places, and they vitiate or subdue the very strong curves of the backbone. The horse even has these things sticking out, as have indeed the dinosaurs. And they stick out in different ways. You see the backbone we could think of as a tube now. And the horse's dorsal spines, they're called, they stick out this way. So when you see the finished horse, you'd scarcely know his backbone went strongly that way, but it does. Now, the horse has hanging from his backbone, depending from his backbone, this rib cage. And right away we run into function and shape. We have 12 ribs. Both men and women have 12 ribs, despite certain superstitions. But the horse has 18. Now that's natural. He needs a great deal of air. He has to gallop over the pampas day and night, you know. He needs a lot of air. That's function creating form, you see. So the horse has a rib cage here that hangs from his backbone. And it has 18 ribs on it. Then the horse's backbone moves backward to the pelvis. And frankly, his pelvis is a great deal like ours, except that it's much flatter. It looked as if it's been run over by a very light steam roller or something like that. But you'll find, as soon as you get familiar with an